Judaism outwards, to make it available for anyone, to make it available for each person. And before I continue about the movement, let me just share some things about the Rebbe, just to give some background so we understand who we're talking about, and about, I have just some personal things that I want to share as well. So if you have a chance to go and read the book, you'll see the Rebbe, the movement started back in Russia, and it wasn't until the 1940s that his father-in-law came to Brooklyn after escaping Russia, the Tsarist Russia, and in 1951 he took over the leadership. The Rebbe took over the Chabad leadership in New York, in Brooklyn, New York. And he really made a dynamic shift in the way the whole movement was, of really spreading out, of making Judaism available to everyone, primarily known as his emissaries, which we call in Hebrew the shluchim. He sent out emissaries throughout the world to establish communities or to help existing communities with the infrastructure, making sure there's schools, making sure there's mikvot, there are those immersing baths, synagogues, centers, whatever is needed for that community to thrive. And that was just, if you think about the Rebbe, that was just one of his things. The Rebbe did many things during his lifetime. And that's what a lot of the book is about the Rebbe and all the things that he did and he accomplished, really looking to it not so much as the movement at large, rather him as a person. Almost you could say a superhuman, if you could say. Well, maybe we'll touch upon some, we'll go through some excerpts from the book, and we'll touch upon the Rebbe's working schedule. But for me, myself, it's the Rebbe's inspiration and the Rebbe's vision. That's why I'm here today. That's why I live in San Diego. That's why I'm actually here talking to you in Barnes & Noble. I'm from New York. I didn't really have much of a connection to San Diego, except I married a girl from here. But when we came and after we got married with the Rebbe's vision, the Rebbe's vision was of having love for every person, love of every Jew. That was what he founded all his campaigns on, was that he sent out emissaries throughout the world to different communities. I'm just one couple of 4,000 throughout the world. In California itself, there's about 230 Chabad centers. Just in California alone, there's about 20 in the county here. And it's because of the Rebbe's vision to see that every person, every community, every Jew should have the ability or the opportunities for their Jewish needs to be taken care of. That he sought and he set out these emissaries to be there, to go establish themselves in these neighborhoods and to complement the existing infrastructure that's there. So it's with that in mind that's why we came to San Diego. We came to here, to East County, to La Mesa, because there was a need here. And even though the Rebbe has passed in '94, that vision, that leadership still lives on. And that's why, in essence, why the book still exists and why it's so popular. Because we're not just reading about some figure that lived 20 years ago in the past century, but we have so much that we could learn. The inspiration from him still lives on. So when I was a child, I've met the Rebbe many times. I can't remember much, though, but I did receive dollars from the Rebbe. The Rebbe would every Sunday, starting from in the mid-'80s, if I could backtrack a little bit, the Rebbe was not some type of great leader that had all these barriers. There were secretaries to go through. You had till you reach and you press the right number, till you're able to actually talk. You could never talk to the CEO, right? He's always too busy. But the Rebbe made himself available for every person. So the first 30, 40 years of his leadership, he actually set up private audiences, what in Hebrew is called yichidus, which is referenced many times in the book. The Rebbe had these private audiences that people would talk to him. It may have been a few minutes, and it may have been a few hours. Interesting to note, those meetings actually began about 9 o'clock and went till about 3 in the morning, 6 in the morning. That's the time of the day that he had available for audiences to actually greet people. And as the years came on and the movement grew, he didn't have enough time to actually have those private audiences. The Rebbe would come on Sunday, every single Sunday. The Rebbe would stand outside of his office and he would have dollars to give to charity. The premise of why he gave out dollars, because the Rebbe said, when two Jews meet or two people meet, a third person should benefit. So he gave them $1 for them to give to charity. So he gave, here's $1 and give it to charity. I myself received a few of those dollars. I got a few pamphlets from him. Myself, I've seen the Rebbe a few times as a child. But though I must say I was too young to really appreciate his wisdom, but I still learned on, and that's why I'm really here, and in San Diego to serve the local community. So now again, we came here today not to speak about myself, but we came to speak about the Rebbe. And you should know, just in interest of full disclosure, I wasn't hired by HarperCollins, the publisher. I wasn't hired by Barnes & Noble, for that matter. I came because this is something that we felt this book has so much meaning in it, so much lessons that we can all apply to our life, Jew and non-Jew alike, actually, that we wanted to help everyone else experience it. Sometimes when people always ask me, well, who's the leader of the movement? Who leads Chabad? Why every time do I walk into any Chabad center around the world, I find a large portrait of him in the wall? I go to the house, there's another portrait. Is he your grandfather? No. Uncle? No. So what is it? What is it? Why do we have such why do we look up to him? Is because that inspiration still lives on. And sometimes it's difficult, myself personally, to articulate how I feel about the Rebbe as a mentor, as a leader, as someone that guides, and I still look for guidance in his teachings. And this book actually helps me a lot. I don't have to talk to anyone anymore, I could just give them the book. So, again, this is not the discussion here is really about a question-answer, so that's really what I just wanted to introduce, and if anyone has any questions, I will do my best, to answer. So, with that in mind. Adam, go ahead.
You talked about the scheduling. I've heard many stories about the kind of miraculous way that he managed to do everything, and then some, beyond like human comprehension. Maybe you have a story that would shed some light on that.
So that's why I actually want to look in the book. Maybe Andrew, you could come read. Maybe want to read that for everyone. You can read this paragraph on the bottom, 119. It's on page 119 if you have the book on the bottom.
While the accomplishments of youth can and often have been exaggerated, the greatest proof of the Rebbe's work ethic was provided in the public sphere during his 40 years as Chabad's leader, at a time when his work schedule was witnessed by hundreds of people. For the entirety of his Nisuit
is his leadership.
The Rebbe did not take any vacations, or for that matter, days off, at least none of that his secretaries were aware of. Americans think in terms of a 5-day work week, 8 hours of work a day, with vacations generally lasting from 2 to 4 weeks a year. Self-employed people often push themselves harder, perhaps working 10 hours a day, sometimes 6 days a week. The Rebbe's schedule was of a different dimension. He was at his office on a daily basis, Sunday through Friday. On Shabbos, of course, he engaged in none of the activities forbidden on that day, such as writing or dictating letters. But he taught, often for many hours, at the Farbrengens that he held on an average of twice a month on the Shabbos after the Rebbe's death on every Shabbos and other Jewish holidays. Teams of Chosrim, trained to recall with great precision the Rebbe's words, would gather when the Sabbath or holidays ended to write down, as faithfully as possible, the lectures the Rebbe had delivered. The Rebbe would later review and edit some of those transcripts. More than 200 volumes of these lectures have been published, evidence that even on this one supposed day of rest, the Rebbe was not resting. To cite just one example, in February 1971, the Rebbe conducted a Saturday evening Farbrengen. It lasted till the early morning hours. While the event was interspersed with singing, the Rebbe's several talks that night lasted approximately 5 hours. That same day, starting just at about 1:30 p.m., the Rebbe had conducted an afternoon Farbrengen, during which he spoke for about 3 hours.
Thank you. That just as a little glimpse into his work life. He never took a day off. He rarely even left New York. Only on one or two occasions, he went to go visit campers in upstate New York. But he worked every day, 6 days a week. And I joke with some other rabbinic colleagues of mine that though everyone else is off on the weekends, our busiest time is on the weekends. So imagine the Rebbe, his busiest time was the weekends as well. He would speak on Shabbat afternoon, and then again sometimes, like we just read on occasion as well on Saturday night, that he could speak at these talks, what we call the Farbrengen, were these gatherings, and he spoke with the Sichot, and meaning his talks, could go on for hours and hours, interspersed with singing. You know, sometimes you could watch these videos online as well of the Rebbe leading these gatherings and the singing that was going on, these inspirational songs. It could go on until 2, 3, 4 easy in the morning. Sometimes the Rebbe would even have the opportunity to even pray because it was for the morning prayers because it was already morning by that time, dimming up the whole night.
How did he keep himself physically fit for all? You must have to be
He
physically
walked to work every day, that's why.
Yeah.
He lived about 2 blocks away from 770, where the
Yeah.
Chabad headquarters, his office, and he walked every day.
But
Sure,
that's
I hope he ate healthy as well.
You have to get on a treadmill to be, I mean, really, to have that stamina for this.
Yeah.
What he's doing.
It's almost like, what can I say? He's not like a regular person.
Yeah.
And God gave him
Yeah, the ability.
the extra stamina.
Yeah, Sherry.
Did the Rebbe write any books?
So that's very interesting. The Rebbe didn't actually author books, but the Rebbe spoke a lot, and all those talks were recorded. I'm glad you mentioned that because it's actually not touched so much in the book. He doesn't really recall so much of the Rebbe's talks and the Rebbe's writings. So the Rebbe didn't actually author books. The Rebbe spoke, and it was recorded, and the Rebbe would then edit those talks in order to go into publication. So it's not really possible for me to be. I have a library of a lot of the talks at home, but let me just to give you an example of the Rebbe's, which I got from the office in New York where they describe all the talks. They said the Rebbe spoke publicly. If you accumulate all the hours, it was 11,000 hours. It was at about 3,200 Fabrengans, which are these gatherings, 3,200 gatherings. And he said, and just to give you an idea of what he spoke about, again, I couldn't bring my library. This is a book which was published last year.
Oh.
Let me just give you an idea how thick it is.
Small book.
This is not a book that's meant for reading. This is an index of all the Rebbe's talks. So if you have a certain topic that you're looking for, to find it in the Rebbe's talks, you open it up in here and you see how small those letters are.
Are those actually what he said?
No.
No.
This is just an index.
Oh.
This is just an index. This is just a reference book.
And where would you? And there's a special library where all this.
Well, in the book, if you own, I happen to own a lot of the books, or if maybe sometimes a library. You can speak to the manager in the back. Say Barnes and Noble should carry them.
Oh.
You get them.
Yeah, but how would synagogues get them so that people may
You
perhaps?
can order it. It's by the
Yeah.
publisher. Chabad even has its own publishing house in New York.
Oh.
It's called Kahus. So I have, I own personally a lot in my home, and this actually helps me. Sometimes, you're looking up and you want to know, what would the Rebbe say? What would the Rebbe say about wine? Where does he speak about wine in different talks? And just looking at wine over here, he references all these columns at different places in the talks, where you could find in the different books that are published some of his talks. So this just gives you a slight idea of the type of wisdom and the knowledge that he imparted to the world.
Could you spell the name of the publisher?
Kahut is K-E-H-O-T or S, but I think O-T would be fine. Kahut is the
And the
publisher.
book is just the title.
This is just an index.
An index of the Rabbi's speech.
Yes.
All right.
All in Hebrew.
No, no, it's not Hebrew. It's
This is
in Hebrew.
there are many things translated, but this is Hebrew.
Oh,
It's a lot of work to get all those talks to get to be published into English.
But he speaks
There are
in
some.
Yiddish.
The Rebbe spoke in Yiddish, so some of them are published in Yiddish as well.
Right.
But the Rebbe, most of the things were actually printed in Hebrew.
But if you understand Yiddish and you got
If you understand Yiddish, you're able to listen.
Right.
You're able to
Right.
listen and understand.
Uh-huh.
I've watched some of the videos as well, which you're able to listen to understand some of the talks that are going on.
Could you describe the process of the Hosrim, the way they would listen and transcribe very carefully?
So what he's asking about is that you said the Rebbe didn't write, the Rebbe didn't, and especially on Shabbat, it's forbidden to use microphones and recording devices. So what would they do? How would they get those talks that the Rebbe spoke on Shabbat, that they should be able to publish them later on? So there's actually a team of people, I guess you could say photographic memory or of great memory, and they would actually take different parts and they would put it to memory during the talk. At least they would get a gist, if not word for word. And then afterwards, when the Shabbat was over, they would put it down in writing, and then they would give it into the Rebbe to actually edit before it was published, which is pretty expansive.
On a little bit of a different subject, could you talk a little bit about his influence on like national leaders of different countries? And I've heard that like he
That's
advised
a great question. It's in, and he actually brings this. Rabbi Telushkin brings a lot of this in his book, and I've touched upon it. He speaks about the Rebbe's relationship with world leaders, from American leaders to Israeli leaders and everything in between. There's one of the recent senators in New Jersey recently went to go pray at the Ohel. The Ohel is the Rebbe's resting place in Queens, New York. And right before his election last year, he actually went to go pray. And the story is why he went to go pray was actually because many years ago he was influenced, beginning his political career, of the Rebbe's blessings, and he felt that he wanted to secure the Rebbe's blessings. Even in 2013, he still went to go seek the Rebbe's blessings. On that note, while I'm speaking about the Ohel is the Rebbe's resting place. The Rebbe used to give blessing when a couple would come to want to get married. Some of the followers, before they made that commitment and got down on that knee, they would go first to the Rebbe for a blessing, that the Rebbe should give them a blessing for their engagement, for their marriage. I myself did that with she was now my wife, but my bride then almost. Before we actually announced our engagement, it's ironic as it sounds, we went to a cemetery. And we went to go solicit the Rebbe's blessings before we actually committed in our engagement, in our marriage. And that's a custom that still continues on to today. Many people do it, hundreds of people do it still. And people do it still, go there for advice. Just like similar to the stories of the book, or how people used to go to the Rebbe for advice. Like you mentioned, some of the leaders from Ariel Sharon, I'm not so good for remembering all the names, but many of the names, and there's correspondence with Ronald Reagan. It says that Ronald Reagan, President Reagan, Ronald Reagan, he used to take, when the Rebbe wrote him a letter, he used to make sure to take it himself and go upstairs in a private area to read it instead of just one of the staffers reading those letters. So Rebbe had a lot of influence on different leaders that they used to come to him from advice. Generals as well in the Israeli military, and it's actually very interesting when Rebbe would speak to them. You're naturally thinking, you're going to come to talk to a rabbi, Hasidic rabbi, what are you expecting to talk about? Oh, Torah, the commandments, the learning, and the Rebbe was very aware of all the intricate details in military strategy, and that's what they spoke about. Very technical military things, not necessarily about esoteric spiritual stuff. That's how knowledgeable he was. The Rebbe studied in university as well, and he was an engineer.
He was an engineer, right?
He was an engineer as well. He studied in Berlin in the late 1920s.
But he came from a religious family.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they still send them to college.
Yeah.
Since
He devotes a chapter to that part. He leaves it to speculation to say why the Rebbe went to that. He feels that his father-in-law, who knew that eventually the father-in-law who was the leader at the time, the Chabad leader, who knew his son-in-law would eventually take over the mantle of leadership, he felt to better be prepared for the American society. That he should have a college education. But that's left to speculation, the author's speculation.
But it shows you the range of his mind.
The range of his mind. The Rebbe spoke. They say he was fluent in, French, German, English, Yiddish, and Hebrew, and understood Italian and Spanish as well.
Probably Russian too.
Russia. I mentioned Russia. I believe. Yeah.
How would the Rebbe get all his information? Did he read newspapers, watch television?
Later on, his secretaries or secretariat used to cut out clippings what they felt would be of interest to the Rebbe instead of actually finding the news that he was looking for. They did that for him, and he was very keen on knowing what's going on in the world, knowing what's going on in Israel in particular, and the different circumstances that were going on about the land, about the peace treaties. There's some amazing stories where, I've just actually read that part of the book today, where they were looking, when Perez was trying to get to to become prime minister, and they took over, I think it was Begin at the time, and they needed to to formulate the new government in the Knesset, and they needed all the votes. And two people that were part of that Agudas Yisrael, one of the political parties, their party agreed to go with Peres, but they felt it wasn't the right thing to do. The Rebbe, if you speak, the Rebbe, it goes to a lot of the Rebbe's opinions in the world, and the Rebbe was actually very against land concessions in the Israeli peace process. And the Rebbe and these two people actually, they just abstained that day from coming to vote, and therefore Peres didn't receive the prime ministership, which is actually interesting. There was Chief Rabbi Lau, Rabbi Yisrael Meir Lau, which was a former chief rabbi of Israel, and he was at the time the chief rabbi of the city of Tel Aviv. And he went to go visit the Rebbe, and the Rebbe said, soon, he says, I think you should conclude some of your affairs in the city, because soon you're going to be the chief rabbi of Israel. And he's kind of taken aback, and he speaks to someone else that's involved in Israeli politics, and he says, did you hear what the Rebbe said? The chief rabbi, he says, if the Rebbe can decide who's going to be the prime minister, he knows who's going to be the chief rabbi of Israel. So that was just an interesting anecdote. So I guess while we think about things, we'll just go to some other parts. If you have the book, or if you want, you could take a book, I guess. You could follow along. Just on the beginning of the book, he starts off very interesting about the Rebbe, the Rebbe was awarded posthumously the Congressional Gold Medal, which is the highest award granted by the American government to a civilian. I'm going to read from the book. It says, this is the beginning on page 3, chapter 1. It says, the rarely awarded gold medal is designated for those who have performed an achievement that has an impact on American history and culture that is likely to be recognized long after the achievement. So at the award ceremony, African-American Congressman John Lewis, the civil rights legend and co-sponsor of the award, noted that perhaps the only issue on which he and the Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, agreed was the importance of bestowing this medal on the Lubavitch Rebbe. Congressman Lewis, citing his awe at the Rebbe's accomplishments, expressed his sorrow that neither he nor his mentor, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., had ever met the Rebbe. Gingrich, yet another co-sponsor, spoke not just of the Rebbe's integrity, but of his respect for the Rebbe's representatives whom he had met in Washington. Gingrich described his good feeling at being approached by one of the Rebbe's emissaries, someone not in the right Gucci shoes, not in the right Italian suit, who doesn't ask you to increase their profit margin, but instead says, for the good of the world. This is something noble and idealistic that should be done. And that's why Gingrich concluded he felt so celebratory that day. Another important aspect to note is the Rebbe's optimistic view that he had on life in general. One of the most notable stories is that in Hebrew, a hospital is called a Beit, originally it was called Beit Cholim, means a home of the sick. And the Rebbe campaigned that why are we calling it the home of the sick? It's a very depressing sound. You go to the hospital, you go to be cured, you don't go to be further sick, further ill. So the Rebbe said we should call it Beit Refuah, the house of healing. Because even though it maybe just be a semantics, that it's just what you call it, but everything that we speak about has an effect. So, and also the patient sitting in the hospital, that they should know, I'm not just going to the Beit Cholim, I'm going to a Beit Refuah, I'm going to a house where to be healed, not to be further ill. Yes, please interrupt with questions. I can go on and on, by the way.
The Rebbe didn't have any children.
No.
Unfortunately not.
It was not personal choice not to have children.
I would
Does anybody
I would assume that, but
know?
that's the Rebbe was actually led a very private life with him and his wife behind closed doors. So there's not much for us to know about that.
Okay, it's just-
Well, I assume, religiously, I know, because I have relatives that are very religious. The children are a blessing, considered a blessing.
Absolutely, the Rebbe felt that as well.
Right. So, it wasn't, I don't think it was his choice.
I don't think it was his choice as well.
He accepted God's will,
Yeah.
something like that. That was it.
But the Rebbe many times referenced the Jewish people as his children. In many a story. Let me just go with another part that I want to talk about. Yeah, so we'll go to page 113. piece was speaking about what we spoke about, just mentioning what we touched upon before about the Rebbe's language and the terms that he used. He says the Rebbe search for non-negative language went well beyond anything that traditional Jewish texts might have intended. He apparently believed that words with bad connotations could trigger harmful associations in even the most innocent of contexts. He avoided the word undertake, lest it trigger an association with the word undertaker. And not surprisingly, no matter how great the pressure to finish a project, he never referred to the due date as a deadline. Once the word deadline is removed from one's vocabulary, one possible alternative is due date. The forbidden expression connoting death and due date connotes birth. So why call things a deadline? You can call it instead a due date. Just so another idea on the book was that for myself, and it's, the author also mentioned it took him 5 years researching the book. And the book is not typically written as an autobiography in a chronological order. It could be, I was a little bit skeptical. It could be a long, boring read, 452 pages, but rather it's written in a very interesting, instead of being a chronological order, rather it goes to different anecdotes and stories, and teaches us a little bit about the Rebbe's life. And what's the important part that I want, what I want to take out of that, or that I hope that you could too as well, if you read this book, to look at what the life the Rebbe led in, and then try in some minuscule way at least to emulate, to see the lessons that he imparted with the world, and try to live up that life as well. That's something about the book.
I'm interested in the relationship between Rebbe and some of the world leaders. I know he himself was very retiring, very skeptical of putting himself forward as a leader, but his status as a leader obviously attracted a great deal of attention to him. I'm curious about how some of these other world leaders came into contact with him. Is this a matter of picking up the phone? Is this a matter of coming and visiting? Is it, what's that process like?
So a lot of the above, the Rebbe did accept himself as a leader, but not as a political leader.
Right.
As a political leader.
Yeah.
So, but many times it was simply a phone call. It was a phone call to the Rebbe's office, and they were able to contact, or there was a letter. There's volumes, I think there's about, it must be around 40 volumes of the Rebbe's letters that were published that he responded in kind to people. It's about 40 volumes of all the letters that he wrote back. A lot of it was through the phone or those private audiences. The Rebbe spoke with some of the Israeli prime ministers on their way to Washington to go meet with the president. They stopped in Brooklyn, surprisingly enough. Which is it's pretty amazing if you think about it. The book touches upon also the Rebbe's relationship with other Jewish leaders as well, and sometimes they may have differing opinions. And even the Rebbe had associations with people from other groups, from the Reform, the Conservative, other Orthodox groups as well. So it's and some of those are worth note. Any other more questions?
I'm going to have like 1,000 questions after I read the book.
Okay.
And so,
Give me a call.
Okay, what's your number?
I actually, while you say that, I did bring here also just to show you the idea of the Rebbe's impact on the world, and at least on myself and what I do day in, day out. Just one thing, so we have a calendar that we published for the community over here, a Jewish calendar. And just show the first page that we started, and you'll find this in many Chabad calendars, has a picture of the Rebbe. Because again, that's the inspiration, and we learn from his dedication. So I did bring a lot of these calendars. If you want to take it home, please feel free, and there's a number on there.
Oh, okay, okay. Thanks.
So what was your question? You had a question? Or you?
Not yet.
Okay.
But
okay.
yeah.
Yes.
Where do you see the growth of Chabad in Lubavitch post the Rebbe's passing? I mean, I know that it's growing, but do you see it continuing to grow in the next generation?
That's a very good question.
Obviously, the leadership I know is a little, is in question now, and if there will be another one. But how do you see it?
Well, the good question is, I could say, where do you see the growth? Just go down the block.
Right.
Chabad of East County opened up under 2 years ago, which you're thinking about. That's already over 20 years, almost, or 18 years after his passing. So something, a man like this, obviously, and that's why it's interesting. You notice the title of the book, and I happened to when I was listening to Dennis Prager show, and he may have heard it. He interviewed the author, Rabbi Joseph Telushkin, and the way Mr. Prager puts it, he says the title, you speak about the life of the most influential rabbi in modern history. So he said that's something that, look, what's modern history? That's something for the last 500 years. That's not something, a life like that, and the leadership he led, will continue to reverberate for years to come. At least past my lifetime.
I read of Chabad's being in the most out-of-the-way places you could never believe. India and all over the world.
Speaking in out-of-the-way places, when I was listening to the Prager show the other day, Chabad is only in 48 of the 50 states. Which two are we not in?
Oh, really?
Mississippi, South Dakota.
Where?
South Dakota?
Mississippi and South Dakota.
Oh.
And why not in those two?
We'll move
A lot of it's technically, Mississippi is actually covered by a lot of the neighboring towns. A lot of the around the state have Chabad centers, whether it's in Missouri or Kansas. So a lot of them actually cater to the group that's there. Another chick that you mentioned, part of the idea, we said we know the Rebbe, you speak about it, the Rebbe's emissaries, and they go to establish these centers throughout the world. And just while I'm on that topic, my mind's just going, so I'm thinking of something else. It's interesting to note when a rabbi is assigned to a post in your typical congregation, they'll start in a small city, they'll fill the term, whether it's 5, 10 years, and then, as they get better at their job, they look for a larger city and a bigger congregation. So the difference that Chabad and how the Rebbe's vision is that when he sent someone there, it was for life. They didn't move even to the smallest town. It was never, this is my stepping stone to somewhere else. And this is, you could say, part of the success of Chabad is that the relationship that they have with the community is not simply just another rabbi that comes into town. This is our rabbi for 30 years already. And we know that he's not going anywhere. Sometimes the rabbi goes, right? If you come to that congregation you like, and the rabbi's a really good speaker, orator, and he's a charismatic fellow, he realizes he can have a bigger post sometimes. But the Rebbe, to sign these positions, it was a lifetime position.
A basic part of bureaucracy in Judaism and synagogues is, of course, the dues system and the building fund. And with Chabad, there's none of that. It's give what you can. Do you find it interesting that the Yodei Tiferet Israel announced the no dues policy?
Imitation, what did I say? Imitation is the best form of flattery?
Yeah.
Yes, it is interesting. This is, and again, I'm not commenting on them and how they structure their synagogue, but the way we feel, and which again built on the Rebbe's wisdom and his understanding, was that a person shouldn't have to, paid, so to speak, to go into synagogue, a place to be Jewish, a place to express themselves. And so that's really what it's built on. And that's always been the long-standing, you could say, structure for the past 30, 40 years. So just an interesting story, and also something that I noticed was maybe a little lacking in the book. The angle that the author looks at it is more from as a person, as a human, and how exceptional he was, which is also very valid. But my understanding, my personal understanding, looking at the Rebbe is also more of if you could call him a superhuman, if it's possible to call him that, or a man who has had prophetic vision and a miracle worker. People came for blessings for children; they couldn't have children; they had children. There's a few of them to mention. There's how the Rebbe saw the falling of communist Russia, and he announced it many times. He screamed for it, and he told it, and the world thought he was nuts. But and actually, it was just a short time later that it fell. It was a very interesting story. There was at a Purim gathering that the Rebbe was speaking, and he said, I'm not going to go through the whole story, but he discussed another story of where everyone was saying "Hurrah, hurrah," as like we think of it as "Hooray, hurrah, hurrah." But if you look at "Hurrah," is also Hebrew for "Hu Ra," means he's evil. And the Rebbe asked everyone to say together, we should all say together, Hoorah, Hoorah 3 times. He's evil. And around the same time is actually when Stalin died. At this time when he said Hoorah in that reference. So there's many, many miracle stories which I felt were maybe lacking in the book. But those are true as well as the Rebbe. One thing he did mention, almost touching upon that, was there was a certain Jew, his name is Dr. Joseph Weinreb. He never really had a connection with the Rebbe. And he had a PhD. He studied psychology, and he went to he lived from New York. He lived in Maryland. He ended up having a midlife crisis, or not midlife crisis, but he had questions about his faith, question about his Judaism, question about his job. What's he doing? He's a psychologist. He's a rabbi. Where's he focusing his efforts? He didn't know where to place things, and he decided he's going to call the Rebbe. But he didn't want to identify himself, so he calls the secretary, and he ends up hearing on the line that the Rebbe's listening in, he presents his inquiry. So, and how does he identify himself? He says, a Jew from Maryland. He says, I'm a Jew from Maryland, and this is my question. So, what is the secretary with the name of Rabbi Chadakov? He passes the question along, and he's listening to the conversation that Rabbi Chadakov is having with the Rebbe. And the Rebbe tells him, Rabbi Chadakov, to tell the person on the phone, he says, tell him, or this Jew of Maryland, that there's a certain person there that lives in Maryland. His name is Dr. Weinreb, Rabbi Dr. Weinreb. He should speak to him. Now, the caller was Dr. Weinreb. He never identified himself as so, but that was Dr. Weinreb. And then eventually he says, but that's me! I'm Dr. Weinreb. He's telling me that Dr. Weinreb. So the Rebbe told him in Yiddish, Oy bazoi, efshem azol reden zu sich allein. He says, sometimes you need to talk to yourself. And he hung up the phone, and it really changed his path in life. To say, sometimes you always need to consult other people, but really we have our own answers sometimes. And we really need to figure out ourselves. It's really on our own shoulders, not to pass the buck to someone else. And he said from that time on, it changed his whole life attitude. Whenever he was presented with a problem, he thought to himself, well, maybe speak to someone else, a little more hesitant. Now he kind of he threw himself into it a little more, saying, I'm going to make the decisions, because the Rebbe said you need to talk to yourself. So this is just one of the anecdotes.
So he was like sort of a psychologist and right at the same time?
Yeah. There's a lot of things. A military strategist, a politician, a rabbi. Okay. Yeah.
I was hoping you would talk a little bit more about the process of scholarship. The Rebbe spoken so many times, so much of that has been transcripted. And you say he's gone back and edited a lot of that and made adjustments. Is he specifically directing in some of those interactions to scripture, or is he just speaking almost off the top of his head?
Well, it's actually everything and anything in between. When the Rebbe would speak about, he actually notes, if you're familiar with some of the other Jewish scholars of Rabbi Soloveitchik from Yeshiva University in New York, who they were actually close friends. It's interesting to note that he was known as the Rav, and the Rebbe was known as the Rebbe. So it's just a cute term. They say the Rav and the Rebbe, and they had a very nice relationship. They actually knew each other from studying in Berlin. They both studied at a university in Berlin back in Europe. And he notes, and he actually this Rabbi Soloveitchik went to one of these talks at the Rebbe in Crown Heights in 770, and after leaving, his students will say, so what do you think? He says, Rabbi Soloveitchik says, when I go to prepare a talk, even for 5 minutes, I spend hours and hours just for those 5 minutes, and I write notes, what exactly I'm going to say, my sources, to prepare even just for 5 minutes. He says the Rebbe just went and spoke for 5 hours. No papers in front of him. And he quoted from all over Scripture, from the Talmud, from the Torah, from the Midrash, from the Zohar, from mysticism, from Kabbalah, you name it. Yes, the Rebbe's scholarship was absolutely brilliant. And many times he would speak on those levels. He would talk about the current Torah portion, and many times spoke about the lessons. That was the very big thing that the Rebbe spoke about, was what does it mean to us? How do we make it relative? We could learn scripture all we want, but what does it mean to us in our life, living today, in today's day and age? So the Rebbe spoke about how we can relate to that and the lessons. So it went from the ultra scholarly talks to something that was really down to earth. The Rebbe sometimes would speak just, I guess you could say, politics. The Rebbe would speak about what's going on in Israel, what's going on in Russia. You have to now it's kind of off our radar, but during the time of the Rebbe's leadership, that was during communist Russia, and that was a big concern for world Jewry at the time. So a lot of his talks would speak about what's happening over there in Russia and to how we need to go about it, and the different stories over there as well. So really, it ranges from everything and anything, or all across the spectrum.
So, as a young man, how much time did he study actually Torah before he got immersed in his doing this? Just Torah alone.
Well, he studied Torah. There's a lot less known about his life before he was a leader, but he was known as a child prodigy. That I think he did when he was already, I believe, 11. The teacher said, "I'm done with him. There's nothing more that I can teach him anymore." But he constantly would study the scripture and the holy books. And there's a story, which I don't think I got a chance to get to that chapter yet, but I saw being referenced, that even when the Rebbe was studying in Berlin, and Rabbi Soloveitchik, we mentioned before, was able to testify because they studied together, he noticed how the Rebbe had a Hebrew book in front of him during the lectures, and still absorbed all the material that he heard, and aced all of his exams. So it's pretty incredible.
Right.
So another thing that, just something to note that we speak about in the book as well, of how the Rebbe had a lot of times a very different approach than other Jewish leaders. And that way you could say Chabad is still sort of marked a little differently. I find it's very amusing personally that if you go to something like, I think it's the Jewish Federation, their website, and they have a listing, I don't know, on Shalom 411, if you're familiar with what that is, it's a listing of all the congregations in San Diego County. So it lists, there's Reform, there's Conservative, there's Reconstructionist, there's Orthodox, and there's Chabad. Chabad doesn't even fall under any of the other ones at all, because the Rebbe had a very different approach than a lot of the other groups. And that's why, so the Rebbe was he began these mitzvah campaigns. It was a very big part of his leadership, and also that he passed on to the emissaries for them to take upon. What were these campaigns? Was that people should take upon themselves to do a mitzvah. If you lived in New York at any time, most notable people know that in New York, you can stop on the street, they have these mitzvah tanks. Mitzvah tanks. What were these mitzvah tanks? Earlier they took these U-Haul trucks or rider trucks that they have in New York. They parked by the curb, middle of Midtown Manhattan or downtown. They would stop the person on the street, says, "Excuse me, are you Jewish?" And the person would either say yes. They say yes. Okay, so let's come put on tefillin. We could go to the truck. Later, those trucks became RVs. They had RVs for the purpose. They're driving down in Manhattan, it's RVs. If you were a woman, it was typically on Friday, they would give out Shabbat candles. And many other groups were opposed to this whole idea. Why are we reaching out? Why are we speak? What cause will it bring about? What benefit is there? So the person put on tefillin once, right? You don't know them, you're strangers. You didn't exchange names or numbers. So you put on tefillin now and he walks away. You gave a woman Shabbat candles. Let's say she even lit the candles. What's going to happen? Well, even if she lights them, then what? So they frowned upon it, but the Rebbe had a whole different outlook. The Rebbe said, we don't understand the preciousness of even one mitzvah that we do. And you never know, but one mitzvah could lead to a person to say, maybe I want to do something else. Maybe I want to share with what I enjoyed or appreciated. I'll do it with someone else. I'll do it again. Next time, I don't have to wait till the rabbi stops me on the street. I'll go over to him. So there's all these ideas. So the Rebbe had the tefillin of lighting candles, having a charity box in a person's home to give charity every day. Now you would think, what's the best way to give charity? Once a year or the end of the year, you write a lump sum, this is my charity. I get my tax receipt and I'm all set. I'm done. The Rebbe said no, because by giving charity, besides the benefit for the recipient, is that it's also a benefit for the giver, because they become a generous person. So only writing it once a year doesn't really change you. But take a box in your home and put even a coin, a small amount, every single day. you now become a different person. You're now a generous person. It actually changes the way you think to be a more generous, kind person by putting in every single day. So these are just some of the things that the Rebbe campaigned about, and they actually led to all the emissaries to also leading out these things to many of these campaigns. The Tefillin campaign of putting on Tefillin is actually connected to the 67 war in Israel, where the Rebbe said putting on Tefillin actually helps save lives and for the protection of Israel. And we all know, if you look at the 67 war and what happened in history, great miracles occurred. That the fact that the Jews and the Holy Land was not only saved, but look at all, they conquered all that extra land. So that's a lot of it. Part of it was because the Rebbe's campaign of putting on tefillin, of that. There's also that mystical, that spiritual benefit of the tefillin, and that it helps protect the Jewish people.
I have to say one thing. When my husband traveled, when he's in out of the country even, he would look for Chabad, for Shabbos, because he could always know that he could go there
That's right.
and find, a Shabbos meal or, live the Shabbat. Yeah.
Sure.
I remember when I moved to San Francisco, I went to a storefront, operation that just opened up recently, and it was for Pesach, Passover, and a couple of Israeli truck drivers just kind of showed up. They heard them park, and out they came, and there they were, and they were just as welcome as anybody else. It was just they had no reservation, and they weren't observant, but they knew that they could come there, and they were so thrilled to do it.
There's actually, on the topic of books, there's actually, besides this book of the Rebbe, there's another book which they might have in stock. It's written by author Sue Fishkoff, and it's called The Rebbe's Army, which speaks more of the element of Chabad around the world. That was published about, 7 years ago.
Yeah.
That's another book that might be of interest. So I'm happy to pause now and continue soon. If anyone's interested in looking at the books or purchasing, I have more calendars. You're welcome to take a calendar. And also, as my job, because even though I came to talk about the book, I'm also a Chabad rabbi, and I also lead life according to the Rebbe. I brought charity boxes for you to take home as well, that you can have in your home, and it's important to be able to give charity every single day. So you're welcome to take a calendar and a charity box.